Through their housing fund, Amazon is creating and preserving affordable homes with 99-year affordability commitments, so families can live in the communities where they work for generations to come.
At Amazon, we believe everyone should have access to a home they can afford, and we're partnering locally to help make that possible.
Support from partners like Amazon help us continue advancing projects that are grounded in our community priorities.
Amazon, proud supporter of local communities like yours.
And now, the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival, featuring journalists and newsmakers from around the country in conversation about the issues making headlines. Thank you for joining us for First America from Pushkin with Daisy Hernandez, moderated by Rebecca Nagle. Before we begin, a special thank you to our members. We'd also like to thank our premier event sponsors, Amazon and HX Expeditions, our founding sponsor, the Carrie and Linda Killinger Foundation, and our host venue, The Pickler.
Osio Nagad, hello everyone, and welcome to the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival. I'm Rebecca Nagle, Gohin Tawadon, and I am so excited to be in conversation today with Daisy Hernandez. Can everyone please help me welcome Daisy? My name is Rebecca Nagle. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation, and I'm a host of the podcast First America. The trailer is out now, and the first episode will drop on June 22nd. This summer, our country is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And most often when I hear the founding story of our country, Native Americans are left out. But without us, you actually don't know what happened. And so from the real reasons our founders rebelled to what type of government we created, First America tells the true story of our nation's founding. And I think in the political moment that we are living through, that truth is really important because part of the reason we don't understand how we got here is actually because we don't know how it started. So subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and the first episode will be out on June 22nd. But today we are in conversation with Daisy Hernandez and her just incredible new book, Citizenship, Notes on an American Myth. I can't stress enough just what a beautiful and gorgeous book this is. I feel like it helped me understand some very complex legal history, but in a very personal and readable way. Daisy is also the author of A Cup of Water Under My Bed and The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease. She also co-edited the feminist classic, Colonize This, and she teaches today at Northwestern University. Can everyone give Daisy a big round of applause? And today, together, we're going to be exploring the intersections of immigration, American empire, citizenship, federal Indian law, and what this all means for our democracy today. So let's get into it. So, like I said, this book is just extraordinary. And I think one of the things that you do so skillfully as you're piecing together this very long history of citizenship and immigration in the United States is how you weave in personal stories. And those personal stories are so powerful because they take these big, abstract laws and bring them down and make them real and make them tangible, I think, for the reader. And so I was wondering if you could just share some of the experiences that you had growing up that shaped how you understood citizenship.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I grew up in an immigrant family, a mixed status family, which meant that everyone in our family had a really different relationship with citizenship. So I have birthright citizenship so far. And My father was a political refugee from Cuba, so he had access to a green card through the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, which gave him a pathway to citizenship. My mother came on a tourist visa. I had other family members who also came on tourist visas. There were family members who married for the purposes of just getting a green card, family members who were under deportation orders. So everybody sort of had a different relationship to citizenship. And did I say my mother's from Colombia, my dad from Cuba, I had an uncle through marriage from Puerto Rico, another one from Peru, neighbors from Guatemala, Mexico, Argentina, so I like to say we're the United Nations of Latinos, located in New Jersey, not that far from the actual United Nations building. But it meant that citizenship was always at the center of the adult conversations. They oftentimes protected us as children, but everyone there was very much trying to get U.S. citizenship. So there were like conversations about working with a fake social, not having papers, having to work in other ways. So that was very much the backdrop to my growing up. And at the same time, I was growing up in the 1980s. And so a lot of what was happening was the question of whether there would be legislation granting amnesty or a pathway to citizenship, which did happen in 1986 and was such an important moment for our communities. And for me, it's been like now we're 4 decades later, right? And we have a federal government that's persecuting immigrant families. It's such a dramatic change from the country that I grew up in. And so part of wanting to work on this book was to understand how we got from there to here, but also to understand a lot of the stories that got erased. You know, as I write early in the book, my mother, you know, never talked about her own status explicitly. She never talked about the role of the Soviet Union and the US in terms of the relationship with Cuba. She never said the word colonialism, or she never talked about empire. But she was like here because money could be earned here that was not possible in South America. And she could become a citizen because she married somebody who was from the Caribbean, and the US has acted like an empire in the Caribbean as it has everywhere else. So I wanted to investigate that too, like the actual political context that were happening, because my mother just talked about getting invitations. She's like, my friend invited me to visit her here in New Jersey, and your father invited me to marry him. And she sort of framed it as this kind of like, almost the storybook version of the US, this kind of like, that we, for a long time, we saw ourselves as a country of invitations and that we were inviting immigrants here. That's kind of also how she explained it. So I needed to disrupt that a little bit too.
Yeah. You do it quite skillfully. I think one of the things that I really like about the book is that it takes a lot of the things that we take for granted or that we think we understand about citizenship, and it kind of turns it on its head. I think one of those myths is that citizenship is kind of black and white. It's either or, right? It's like an on-off switch where you are a citizen or you aren't. And you argue in your book that actually it's more complicated than that. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I go back to the work of the sociologist T.H. Marshall, and he was looking at the development of citizenship in England. So he was looking at very specific citizenship of white men in England, but it's still useful for us. And he identified these 3 kinds of citizenship: a civil citizenship, political citizenship, and then a social citizenship. And when we talk about citizenship, we're usually talking about the first 2, the civil and the political. Do you have the right to vote? Do you have the right to own property, for free speech, things like that? But what really caught my attention was the last one, this social citizenship. Do you have a right to education? Do you have access to education? Do you have a right to see a doctor? What is actually the quality of your citizenship into your day-to-day life? And that resonated with me because I think for Black, Indigenous people of color in the US, that when we talk about feeling like second-class citizens, we're often talking about social citizenship and the limits that come with that as well. And then part of what I wanted to explore in the book too is that, and I think this is because citizenship was so central for me at a really young age, that I really knew it played such a critical role in someone's life. And my comparison, you know, I talk about it as a social construct. Just the way that we think about race in a lot of ways, or that I hope we think about race, or that we're aware that, a white person walks into a boutique or a very high-end clothing store and they're not expecting to be followed by security. But a black person walks into that store and they probably are expecting that could happen. And similar with citizenship, if I have citizenship, I don't have to give it a second thought that I can jump in my car and drive for 5 hours to go see my daughter at college. But if I don't have citizenship, then I'm going to think twice before I get into that car, drive across state lines. I could be really vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think more and more of us this past year are aware, since Trump came into office, are aware that we have so many immigrant families right now that are staying home still. I spoke to someone recently in Chicago, where I live now, he is the person, his mom has been home for months. She is afraid to go out. So he's the one that goes to get groceries, that goes to the pharmacy, that is basically anything that she needs. And so that is, a social construct that completely shapes our lives.
Yeah. I think one thing too, when we think about myths in American citizenship, I think one of those myths is that everybody wants to be a citizen and that American citizenship is automatically this good thing. And I think as a Native person, one thing that's very true about our history is that actually we didn't want to be US citizens, and our ancestors actually fought to not be US citizens. And I think for some people that's it's sort of counterintuitive, but think about it. If the government is an invading army, you don't want to vote in their next election. You want the invading army to leave your land. And so even in my own family, when my great-grandfather became a US citizen in the early 1900s, it was part of a larger scheme to break up Cherokee land and open it for white settlement. And so the land was kind of the stick, and then citizenship was the carrot. And so it was this way to say, we're providing equality to Native Americans, but it was actually about assimilation for the sake of taking actually more of our land. And there are colonized people today, like people in American Samoa, that are actually still fighting to not be US citizens because they want to maintain their identity separate from the US. And so I think that was one thing that I thought was really great and really an interesting intersection in our work.
Yeah, there was a moving quote that I included from a tribal leader in the early 1920s, because indigenous people didn't have access to citizenship wholesale until 1924. And he's a tribal leader who says, we don't want to vote in the white man's election. We lose the right then to be leaders in our own clan. Yeah, it was very moving.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of times, because even on internet, you'll see these memes of especially this past year or in 2024, this is the 100-year anniversary, and a lot of non-Native people celebrating it. And for Native people, actually becoming U.S. citizens is this really complicated moment that actually, in many cases, eroded our sovereignty. So we're talking about different types of citizenship, and one type of citizenship that is in the news a lot today is birthright citizenship. On his first day in office, Trump signed an executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship in the United States. Since then, that executive order has been under litigation, and we should actually hear in the next month whether or not the Supreme Court is going to uphold that order or strike it down. And I wanted to hear from you, where did this idea of birthright citizenship, where did it come from, and why do you think it's under fire right now?
Yeah, so the origin of birthright citizenship, this goes back to the Civil War, and we really have, in a lot of ways, and scholars have documented this, we have Black Americans to thank for this idea. They were arguing from the beginning, we are birthright citizens in this country. And so we have the 14th Amendment, but even with the 14th Amendment, there were actually arguments about who does this include, actually? Does it only include those who were enslaved and the children of the enslaved? Does it include the children of Chinese, of gypsies? This was the kind of language that was being used, right, among congressional members. And there's a wonderful passage, again, in the historical records and congressional records of a senator, I believe it was, saying, yes, it does. It includes the children of the Chinese. It includes the children of gypsies. It includes anyone who was born here. So the arguments have been there from day one, and there's been clarity on both sides of what both sides wanted. But in terms of this present moment, this started back in the the 90s, and I would argue really in a lot of ways as a backlash to that 1986 legislation that granted citizenship, but perhaps more broadly as a backlash to the world that got created by the civil rights movement, by gay liberation, by the women's rights movement. I mean, you have a really different kind of citizen that emerges in the US in the second half of the 20th century. There's a scholar who says, it's a bolder, it's a feminine citizen that we didn't have before. So I'd say it's a backlash to that. But the Republican Party has had this in some way on their agenda since the 90s. It was considered fringe. There was a Congress member who proposed legislation to do away with birthright citizenship, I think starting in 2011, and just kind of introduced legislation every year until he was kicked out of Congress. So it has a really long history, and there have been a lot of different arguments, including, it was only meant for those who were enslaved, including, it doesn't include giving birthright citizenship to the children of those who are invading our country. And then the idea is that immigrants are invading our country, which is not historically how we have seen immigrants in this country. So there have been a lot of different arguments around it, and right now it's around jurisdiction. And so whether, if you listen to the Supreme Court case around this, the arguments, a lot of it was about the domicile. Where is home? And it was so surreal to listen to that conversation, because you have families who have been here for 30, for 40 years. Their children were born here. They've raised their kids here. And they're sort of arguing that, no, their domicile, their home is in Mexico or El Salvador or another country. I feel like this is where I should say, the legal scholars are generally optimistic and believe that the 14th Amendment will hold. I myself am not so optimistic, because I have been disappointed by the Supreme Court. So I am kind of bracing myself to see what happens.
I feel like that. I feel like so much of what we're in right now feels very unpredictable, and the ground is moving underneath us. And I also think I really sympathize with you, because I feel like so often we've been told, the center will hold, the structure will hold, everything is going to be fine, and then the rupture kind of just keeps rupturing. And so, one of the things I wanted to bring up in relationship to the birthright citizenship case, there are a bunch of different arguments that the Trump administration is using to try to take down birthright citizenship. But one of the arguments that made headlines right after oral arguments is that his lawyer, arguing before the Supreme Court, argued that Native Americans don't have a constitutional right to birthright citizenship. And that's actually true. We are actually carved out of the 14th Amendment. If you read the amendment, it excludes, that time we were called Indians. And there was actually a case in the late 1800s. A man who was a citizen of the Winnebago tribe went to try and go vote in a local election. And the voting registrar said, you can't vote, you're not a citizen, you're not even eligible for citizenship. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Trump administration is actually leaning very heavily on that case, because the case law is almost always on the other side, that birthright citizenship does apply to, the children of immigrants, but they have this one case of, someone who's born in the United States, born on U.S. soil, grew up on U.S. soil, where the Supreme Court says, actually, yes, the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to you. And I think so often in the United States, we think of these issues as being sort of unrelated or separate or siloed. We don't think of laws and policies that our government passed to colonize indigenous people or to take indigenous land having anything to do with immigration law and immigration policy today, but actually they're really intimately connected. And one thing that I thought about a lot in your book was about how much the story of American empire is part of the story of immigration. And I think one of the things it's almost like I feel like we don't know how to talk about it as a country. Maybe we don't know how to see it. But we know how to talk about our democracy kind of looking inward, right? Like we know how to talk about the land that is here, that is the United States, the people that live here. We don't know how to talk about this arm of our government that extends outside of that place and into all of these other parts of the globe. And I think as an Indigenous person, I feel that erasure often, because I think it's one of the reasons we don't know how to talk about Indigenous history. But yeah, I was wondering if you could just explain, like, why for us to understand immigration in the United States do we need to tell the story of American empire?
Yeah, and to begin with, as you said, we don't usually think of ourselves as an empire, thanks to political leaders over many, many decades, I would say the entire history actually of our country, who've insisted that we are not an empire, and tried to distinguish ourselves from the British Empire, when in fact, the United States has been so intimately involved, both through federal policies and also through businesses, in really the day-to-day lives of people who live, in my case, my focus is on Latin America, but this applies across the globe. And part of what I argue in the book, and drawing on the work of this incredible legal scholar, Professor Achume, who's at UCLA, that she argues that, when you have an empire, when you have a government that can shape so much of the business life and of the government life in another country, then basically people who live in those countries are already already have political membership in our country as well. So I argue that when people arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border, in a lot of ways they already are members of our political body. They already actually in a way are citizens. Mm-hmm. Their lives have been shaped day by day by our policies. We've been, just in the 20th century, the U.S. was involved in something like more than 30 regime changes throughout Latin America, or supported or outright took out people. And we just saw this, intensely with Venezuela, obviously, but that is not the first time. In a lot of ways, this Trump administration is taking us back to where we've been in the past. But it is what you say, and I think this is where I just love your work on this new podcast, First America, because I think part of what you're drawing there is that there's so much of our history that we don't know, and that has been shaped, like we've been given a narrative about U.S. history. And it includes a story that we're not an empire, that we bring democracy everywhere, when in fact we bring empire everywhere. And very similar, in terms of like our origins. I don't think that, when we think about the origins of this country, we don't think about the fact that, warfare was being, that people, the kind of the level of just cruelty and violence that was being executed against indigenous communities during that time. And this, you've talked about it as like, that U.S.-Mexico border, the entire country was already, right, was this border dispute, basically.
Yeah, I think like when we think about like, why is the U.S. border so militarized? Well, it's like, for the first century of our republic, our border was a literal war zone. Like that, like that's how we expanded, was as an invading army. And I really appreciate what you're saying about the founding, because I think our big kind of like the heart of the American myth, right, is that our founders threw off the king. They said no to colonialism. They said no to empire, and they built a democracy, right? That's sort of I think that's the conversation on the right, but also on the left. That's sort of how you get the rhetoric of like a no kings protest, right? Is that our founders threw off colonialism. And that's only half the story. I mean, they did build a democracy. They built, obviously, a flawed democracy that included a very small group of people. But at the same time that they were building that democracy, they were very consciously building an empire. They actually called it an empire for liberty. And there's this interesting thing that happens where around the same summer that our founders write the Constitution, Congress passes this law called the Northwest Ordinance, and it sets up how the U.S. is going to expand from like basically Ohio to Minnesota, like the Great Lakes region. And that area during expansion is not governed by democracy. It is top-down, autocratic, appointed rulers that are governing down to the ground. And that's how we govern all U.S. territories as we expand. And then that's how we govern places like Guam and Puerto Rico. And so there's this whole arm of our government that's actually not democratic at all, right? I mean, I think you could very well call it authoritarianism, that we've sort of trained and taught ourselves as Americans not just like how not to see it. Yeah, and I think for me, that was these connections with history and sort of, I feel like we're living in this moment where everyone's kind of like, how is this happening? How did we get here? You know, and I think especially with immigration, and I think one of the beautiful things that your book does that I think is a real gift of your book is that you go back to ancient Athens and like teach me stuff about Aristotle that I did not know, which is that Aristotle was an immigrant. Did we know that? I did not know that. And so I feel like that's one of the amazing gifts of your book is sort of the history that you lay out really step by step helps us understand how we get to the present moment. And I just was so curious to hear from you with all of the research that you did. What was the thing that you found that was the most surprising? Like what in the history surprised you the most?
There were so many surprises. And so actually Aristotle was a surprise because I found out, oh, he's like my favorite Theo. He basically is an immigrant in ancient Athens. He has a green card, but without the option of becoming a citizen. He was called a metic. And so there were special privileges and there were special taxes to pay. But that is not usually how I think about Aristotle, not usually how he is spoken about. So that was a huge surprise. Another surprise was that women here in the US in 1907 could lose their birthright citizenship if they married a foreigner. And then in the 1920s, it got revised so you could keep your citizenship if you married a foreigner as long as you didn't marry someone from Asia, essentially, somebody who couldn't become a citizen. And all of that doesn't actually fully get lifted until 1940, which is sort of like the first half of the 20th century almost. That was such a surprise. Something that was also a surprise was just learning more about what happened to the Mexican American community in the US during the 1930s, where like more than 1 million Mexican Americans were deported, and more than half of them were citizens, were the children of immigrants. And this is coinciding with the Great Depression. It's a shadow deportation government. It wasn't a federal policy, but it was being handled at the state level and the local level. And so you just had, the idea that you have more than 1 million people taken out of the country was really astonishing to me as well.
Yeah, I think what I really appreciated about the history in your book is that you can kind of look at some of those old policies and think, that's wild, like that doesn't make any sense. Like the idea that if a woman who's a US citizen marries an immigrant from Asia, she forfeits US citizenship. But then what you lay out in your book is that our current immigration system is just built on top of all of that, right? And so it's sort of, I feel like for me, it helped me see sort of the water that we're swimming in, the air that we're breathing, like these structures that because we live in it, it feels so normal, but actually when you break it apart, it doesn't follow the sort of the logic that we pretend that it has.
Yeah, absolutely. I always like to remind people too that as early as 1790, Congress passed legislation saying you can't naturalize as a US citizen unless you're a white immigrant. So the racialization was there very, very early on.
Yeah. One thing that I learned as we were reporting First America, and this is the work of a scholar named Maggie Blackhawk, who's a professor at NYU and who's Ojibwe that we interviewed, is how early immigration policy actually was kind of built on top of what our government did to Native Americans. And it takes a couple steps to get there. So, we colonized Native people, we dispossessed Native people of our land. And then there was an era in like the early 1900s where people thought we had done a very good job of doing that and we should keep doing it. So you used to be able to get a PhD from Harvard in colonial administration and like how to administer a colony. And actually some of the people who taught colonial administrations are like considered like the fathers of political science. Like this stuff goes really deep. And so what they did is once we, stopped expanding from sea to shining sea and expanded to places like the Philippines or Guam or Puerto Rico, they very intentionally took what our government did to Native Americans and applied it to the colonies. And I think the best example is in the Philippines because there was an ethnic group in the Philippines that they didn't want to have to extend US citizenship to. And so they thought if they could classify them legally as Indians, they wouldn't have to. There are boarding schools in the Philippines, like very similar to what our government did to Native Americans. And then when you get the creation of immigration law in the 1900s, they take what we did in the colonies and they want to bring it into immigration law. And so there was this man who helped administer what we did in Panama, and he really thought that, technocrats and men who knew best were better for creating laws and policies than democracy. Democracy was too messy, people don't know what's best for them, and if we just have really smart and skilled technocrats, that's the best way to build policy. And so when he was helping craft immigration law, first as someone sort of making these arguments and then later as a justice on our Supreme Court, he wanted immigration law to be administrative, right? And so it doesn't have the same types of due process and constitutional rights that we think of as applying to all people, but we don't apply those laws to immigrants. Instead, it's administrative law, it's under the executive, and that is not the only, but one of the reasons why our current administration has so much power over it, because we actually very intentionally set it up that way. And I think that's, for me, is one of the things of that I've just found both in your book and the history we've done for the podcast, is that I think a lot of times people have these questions of how could this be happening in the United States, or sort of how did we get here? How can a president do this? And we have this knee-jerk reaction that what we're seeing is unconstitutional or illegal, right? That what we're seeing is wrong and shouldn't happen in the United States. But it's something that the US government has done before. It's just done to people that we don't talk about. It's done to indigenous people. It's done to immigrants. It's done to people who live in the territories. And that's just a part of our government we've been really trained to not see. But that actually has always been part of the US government. And so some of these things that we're seeing right now that feel very authoritarian, right? I think that are authoritarian, there's always actually been a part of our government that functioned that way, that governed people down to the ground, that was top down. You wouldn't have elections, you wouldn't have accountability, the courts have less power. Yeah, and that's been part of our government for a really long time. And I think one of the very powerful things you did in your book is how you made some of these policies around how we treat immigrants, especially the access to healthcare. That was something that I really learned in your book. And I appreciated you sharing how even you learned about that at certain points of, I think, we as American citizens don't see all of the policies that our government passes that exclude and marginalize immigrants. And there's a way that those policies are actually kind of rendered invisible or hard to see. And that's the one thing that I think is the real gift of your book, is sort of how you help us see those things that I think our society has trained us not to see.
Yeah, and I think you bring up such a good point that there's been kind of a shock to the system this past year, and that a lot of it has been seeing this done to citizens. But this has been done to immigrants at the border, for many, many, many years, obviously to indigenous people. And, I think to myself that, if we accept this happening to any group of people, you can't be surprised when it shows up at your front door either. But we have been surprised and we have been shocked. But in reality, it's we have been doing this for so long, it just wasn't happening perhaps to you and me, right? And so we feel like we can put it, we can kind of check out a bit. It has a different resonance when people say, okay, that's a citizen and it shouldn't happen to that person. But that's part of what I wanted to unpack in my book is obviously a piece of paper should not determine whether you get to live or die today.
Yeah, or have access to healthcare or things like that. And I think that's one thing as an American I think we don't realize is that it doesn't, if you're not a citizen in other countries, maybe you can't vote, but it doesn't mean that you don't have access to the same kind of constitutional rights, in the way that it's sort of all encompassing in the United States.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned the healthcare, because that's actually where this book started, was with that chapter about healthcare.
Oh, really? Was that the first part that you wrote?
That was the first one that I wrote.
Wow,
because,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, because my last book had a lot to do with healthcare, and I I knew from my own family's experience that there had been a moment in time in which healthcare was not tied up with your citizenship status, where now it is. And so I wanted to really understand how that happened. And it was legislation in 1996 that said, someone with a green card, if you don't have the money to see a doctor, you don't qualify for federal Medicaid dollars until you've been in the country for 5 years, which means then that the state where you live makes a huge difference, because you might live in a state where the state uses its own Medicaid dollars, so that if you're here in your third year, again, this is for folks who have a green card, you can maybe have access to those state Medicaid dollars, and you might be able to see a doctor. And then with people who are undocumented, it's so different depending on where you live in the country, because you have states like California that give medical care and access beyond just the emergency room to people who are undocumented. And then there are states who, it doesn't matter if you're a 5-year-old who needs to see a doctor, unless you get to that state where you need an emergency room, they're not going to take you in. And part of what was surprising for me in doing that research is that I think many of us who aren't in this situation think, oh, when you go to the emergency room, that's clear cut, like you need to be seen and taken care of. But it's not the case. You have doctors in emergency rooms trying to figure out what they can cover and what they can't. So if you need dialysis, for example, that's considered a kidney dialysis. It's a chronic condition. You need access to care on an ongoing basis. But so when you walk into that emergency room, you have to be considered a point of life and death in order for you to receive emergency dialysis. And there were incredible doctors who've done studies just showing, of course, if a person is relying on emergency dialysis, they're much more likely to die than someone who's receiving treatment as they should be. So we have this kind of, as I talk about in the book, a state-based citizenship right now, where your citizenship is really tied up to where you live, including for birthright citizens, because your access to reproductive rights, or your access to an abortion, looks really different in Illinois than it does in Indiana. The same is true for folks who are transgender themselves, or have kids who are transgender and need gender-affirming care. Or even, like right now, Florida has passed a law that they can arrest you if you're using the bathroom that the police officer doesn't think you should be using. So going to Florida as a trans person or living there is a really different experience than living in Washington.
Yeah, and I appreciated how you talked about how right now in the U.S. we're also living in a moment where, trans families with a trans child might be moving states. And so we can almost think of our country right now as having internal refugees, where someone might be moving from Oklahoma to Washington so that their kid can access gender-affirming care and be safe. And I think, again, that kind of almost goes back to what we started off by talking about, where I think we've been so trained to think that citizenship is a yes or a no or an all or a nothing, when actually it has almost all of these different gradients to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in our current political climate, I think that a lot of people feel like we need to figure out some way to reach the other side, right? To bridge the divide, to heal what is broken in our politics. And in the book, you talk about sitting down with your cousin who voted for Trump. And
wanted to vote for Trump.
And having a conversation with him about those politics and the understanding that you walked away from that conversation with. And I was wondering if you could tell the story of that conversation.
Yeah, so my cousin, who I do not name in the book, is a gay man, gay immigrant. He does not have citizenship. He was not able to vote, but he very much wanted to vote for Trump in actually all of the elections, but including this last one. And because I work in higher education, and part of what we've been talking about is how can we have civil discourse with one another? How can we reach across the aisle and understand each other across our differences? So I basically tested this out with my cousin, like, okay, if we sit down and have a lot of conversations, can I understand where he's coming from? Can he understand where I'm coming from? And part of what I came to appreciate is how deeply shaped he was by growing up in Cuba, by having been a gay man there during a time when gay men were imprisoned, and how much he blamed anything that was communist or socialist. He felt very suspicious of and worried about. And he saw Trump as promising to help him keep what he has found in this country. And he's been in this country for over 20 years. And so he saw Trump as like promising protection of some kind. And my cousin is, if he walked into the room and you didn't speak to him or know anything about him, you would probably identify him as a white man in his 60s. And so that plays a part too. He has like a very good life here in the US, despite not having citizenship. He does have status. And so he has a lot to protect around his privileges. And I think he listened to me. He was like very curious. He's like, your mother's from Colombia, your father's from Cuba. How did you turn out like this? He thinks I should be, in understanding with him. And he made a really powerful statement in one of our conversations, talking about a dictator in Chile who ordered the murders of thousands of people, Pinochet, if you know him. My cousin said, yeah, he murdered so many people, but he saved his country from communism. And that was quite a moment for me. That moment really broke me because I realized we were having very different conversations. And I came to realize that my cousin didn't need any more information. He didn't need facts. He has lots of facts. He has a lot of information. He has the intensity of the story that he carries with him. And I realized that there was no meeting on common ground because it was actually not a political debate. And the way that I like to describe this is that a political debate is that, for example, we have $3 million, and my cousin thinks we should invest the $3 million in the Small Business Initiative, and I think we should invest the $3 million in the local high schools. So we can argue about that, and we can kind of come to a compromise about how we should spend this money. Maybe I agree, okay, you get $2 million, the high school gets $1 million. We can figure this out. We can reach a middle ground. But what we're talking about are actually questions of morality. These are much larger questions about whether a man in the White House gets to decide who lives and who dies just based on his own whims, essentially, his own interpretation of the law, essentially. So I don't think this is more of where we were with the civil rights or with gay liberation or women's rights, where it was a question of morality. We decided to do away with the official Jim Crow, and we can absolutely talk about the fact that we have a new Jim Crow, but we made certain decisions at that point in time, and I think we're at another crossroads like that, where we have to make another set of moral decisions as a country. So I write a lot about going into grief, because I think some of what we're doing as a country, collectively, individually, is avoiding the grief. And if you're like me, you've unfriended certain family members or friends on social media. I know there's family that are no longer having meals together, or anniversary meals and things like that, and holidays. But I think part of what's happening, Americans, we don't do grief really well. It's not our thing. Yeah. But I argue in the book that grief can be really clarifying. It can really clarify what your values are, where you want to spend your energy and your time. And I realized I didn't need to continue having these conversations with my cousin. He was really clear. I don't need to push him out completely, but I don't need to try to convince someone who has such fundamental different value system than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that piece of grief is really interesting, because I think the other thing we have to grieve is what we thought our country was. Yeah, I think in the political moment that we're living through, there's sort of this, I see people taking a couple different paths of sort of thinking, okay, well, if we can just wind the clock back, if we could just wind the clock back by a decade, we would be fine, right? If we can just get back to where we were more of a democracy. And I think what I've realized both in reading your book and the history that we've done for the podcast is that time before actually doesn't exist, right? And I think what we have to do is get very honest and very real about what this government has been, what it's been from the beginning. Because I think if we keep sort of telling these narratives of okay, well, if we defeat this one leader, if we win this one election, then we'll defeat authoritarianism, then we'll defeat fascism. To me, the way I think about it is sort of almost like cutting the head off of a weed. It'll only grow back stronger. And if we actually really want to root these issues out, if we actually really want to solve these things, we have to get down to the roots and find out where it was planted, and that way we can pull it out. Yeah, so, but I think this book is extraordinary. It helps us understand so much about how we got to where we are today in a way that I think is absolutely essential information and knowledge.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much.